The story begins not with bombs falling or armies marching, but with an intuition, a quiet, unsettling calculation that Winston Churchill sensed years before the world understood it. In the mid-1930s, when Britain clung stubbornly to illusions of lasting peace, Churchill saw something else, a geopolitical horizon darkening with terrifying precision. His warnings of German rearmament were dismissed in Parliament as alarmism, relics of a man still haunted by the Great War. Yet deep within his private papers, charts, letters and intelligence summaries accumulated like storm clouds. He studied Hitler's speeches meticulously, noting not only the words but the pauses, the crescendos, the dangerous sincerity of fanaticism. In these early years, the seeds of a hidden strategy were sown, not a plan to crush Germany immediately, but a long game built on foresight, pressure, positioning, and an understanding of how dictators overreach. Churchill recognized what most democracies refused to see, that Hitler was not simply preparing for another European conflict, but for a war of annihilation. While the British establishment believed that concessions could tame Berlin, Churchill quietly mapped out what he called the iron sequence, the predictable pattern in which totalitarian powers escalate until confronted decisively. He examined every German industrial expansion, every Luftwaffe training report, and the movements of steel, oil, and rubber across Europe. His approach was unorthodox. Instead of focusing solely on German troop numbers, he studied supply chains, production cycles, morale indicators, and ideological fervor. It was this holistic comprehension, invisible to most statesmen, that shaped a strategy he would not reveal to the public, preparing Britain not for a short war but for a long, brutal contest of endurance. This early vision became Churchill's obsession. While his critics mocked him as a warmonger, he quietly built alliances with journalists, military officers, and sympathetic civil servants. He cultivated a shadow network, not a spy ring but a constellation of observers who fed him data that the government preferred to ignore. They sent him scraps of information: German steel imports from Sweden, nighttime factory expansions in the Ruhr, unexplained troop movements near the Czech border. Each detail, insignificant alone, became part of a mosaic Churchill alone seemed able to see. This was the birth of the hidden strategy, a plan built not on public declarations, but on a private conviction that Britain would one day be forced to stand alone. Even then, Churchill understood something else. Britain's greatest weapon would not be its fleet, nor its colonial resources, nor its airfields scattered across the empire. It would be time. If Britain could survive long enough, just long enough, then Hitler's empire, driven by ideology rather than realism, would overextend and collapse under its own weight. The challenge was brutal: how to buy time when the enemy sought lightning war. Churchill's early writings show him wrestling with this paradox. He argued that Britain must invest in air defense systems, radar networks, emergency food reserves, and industrial dispersal long before war began. His speeches were met with polite indifference. Yet the infrastructure he pushed for, radar stations, aircraft production lines, anti-aircraft networks, would later save Britain in 1940. In these years of political exile, Churchill refined the psychological dimension of his strategy. He knew that Hitler was as much a creature of perception as of military calculation. If Britain appeared weak, conciliatory, or divided, Hitler would strike swiftly. If Britain appeared resolute, even beyond its actual capacity, Hitler might hesitate, miscalculate, or divert his energies eastward. Churchill studied the dictator's personality with forensic precision. He noted how Hitler responded to bluster, how he misread democratic patience for incapacity, how he fixated on symbolic gestures. Churchill realized that Britain's greatest advantage was not military superiority, but unpredictability, the ability to appear confident while secretly scrambling to rearm. Privately, Churchill also examined Britain's vulnerabilities with the harshness of a surgeon. He studied the nation's reliance on imported food, its fragile merchant navy, the political divisions within Parliament, and its outdated doctrines of colonial warfare. His notes reveal a man who anticipated failure points years before they manifested: fuel shortages, munitions deficits, and the slow mobilization of civilians into wartime labor. But instead of despairing, Churchill formulated remedies: naval convoy systems, stockpiling strategies, and plans for industrial conversion. These would later become the backbone of Britain's survival, but in these early years they remained largely invisible, whispered only to those who understood his urgency. As Europe edged toward catastrophe, Churchill refined the spiritual element of his hidden strategy: the cultivation of national resilience. He believed that the coming conflict would demand sacrifices far greater than those endured in the Great War. To prepare the nation psychologically, He began advocating for policies that subtly emphasized discipline, unity, and preparedness. His radio broadcasts and newspaper columns carried a dual message, warning of danger while elevating the British character as uniquely suited to withstand it. He was preparing not just armies but hearts, a fact lost to many contemporaries but crucial to understanding his later success. Throughout the late 1930s, Churchill watched events unfold exactly as he had predicted. The Rhineland, Austria, the Sudetenland, each step validated his warnings. Yet his enemies in politics remained powerful. What kept him committed was the knowledge that when the final crisis came, Britain would need someone who had thought beyond immediate diplomacy. His strategy, never publicly declared, would become the foundation of Britain's survival. But the most surprising part was this: Churchill never intended to defeat Hitler through sheer might. He intended to defeat him by letting the dictator defeat himself. The war that was coming would be won not by matching Hitler blow for blow, but by orchestrating a long, grinding confrontation that Germany was structurally incapable of sustaining. That was the hidden strategy, the one Hitler never expected because he never imagined Britain would endure long enough for it to matter. When Germany struck Poland in September 1939, the world finally collided with the truth Churchill had been warning about for nearly a decade. Yet even in that moment, few understood the magnitude of the disaster unfolding. Churchill, summoned back into government as First Lord of the Admiralty, did not celebrate vindication. Instead, he recognized with grim clarity that Britain was entering a war for which it was only partially prepared. The rapid destruction of Polish defenses confirmed his fears. Hitler's war machine had fused ideology with industrial efficiency, creating a new form of mechanized brutality. Blitzkrieg, still poorly understood by Allied generals, was not simply military innovation. It was the realization of the dictator's belief in speed, terror, and annihilation. Churchill's hidden strategy, endurance above all, suddenly became Britain's only viable path. As France and Britain declared war, Churchill began quietly shaping an approach that differed sharply from the conventional strategies circulating among Allied commanders. While many believed the coming months would resemble the slow, trench-bound attrition of the previous war, Churchill understood that Hitler would not wait. Germany's reliance on synthetic fuel, limited oil reserves, and rapid consumption of armored vehicles meant that its early victories were powerful but unsustainable. Churchill believed that if Britain could prevent Germany from securing quick dominance, the Reich's internal contradictions would eventually tear it apart. But this required time, precious, costly time, and he knew time would have to be purchased through sacrifice. The fall of Norway in early 1940 offered painful proof of this reality. Churchill, one of the architects of the Norwegian campaign, watched the plan unravel with a bitterness that cut deeply into his confidence. Yet even in failure he saw opportunity. The disaster exposed Neville Chamberlain's inadequacies, weakening the government and paving the way for Churchill's rise. On May 10, 1940, the same day Hitler unleashed his devastating assault on Western Europe, Churchill became Prime Minister. The coincidence was not lost on him. He later wrote that taking office at that moment felt like stepping onto a stage already engulfed in flames. But what the world did not yet see was that Churchill entered office with a strategy fully formed in his mind, built over years of isolation. France's collapse stunned Britain to its core. The German onslaught through the Ardennes, dismissed by French leadership as impossible, tore their defenses open with terrifying speed. Churchill tried desperately to coordinate with French commanders, but political paralysis, outdated doctrines, and miscommunication doomed the Allied effort. As German divisions closed in on Dunkirk, Churchill faced an impossible dilemma: whether to commit more troops to a battle already lost or to begin preparing Britain for a solitary stand. He chose the latter, a decision historians later hailed as one of the most consequential in history. The evacuation at Dunkirk, miraculous though it was, revealed the truth: Europe had fallen. Britain now stood alone against an empire that had consumed an entire continent in a matter of months. Yet for Churchill, standing alone was not a weakness, it was the core of his hidden strategy finally revealed. He knew that Hitler expected Britain to sue for peace. The dictator misread democracies as weak, their people incapable of prolonged hardship. Churchill, however, understood something Hitler did not. Democracies could endure if their cause was righteous and if their leader could articulate the stakes with unwavering clarity. The speeches that followed were not improvised bursts of emotion. They were carefully calculated instruments designed to prepare the British psyche for a long war. When Churchill declared that he intended to fight on the beaches, he was not merely inspiring courage, he was anchoring the nation to the strategy of endurance that would define the conflict. During these critical weeks, Churchill began implementing the second, more subtle element of his strategy, deceiving Hitler into believing Britain possessed far greater military strength than it actually did. He ordered constant naval patrols, increased radio traffic and publicized inflated aircraft production numbers. He also supported the development of the Home Guard, not merely as a defensive force but as a psychological symbol. To Hitler's intelligence services, these actions suggested a nation preparing for invasion with far more resources than they had estimated. This disinformation campaign, understated but effective, played a crucial role in convincing Hitler to delay Operation Sea Lion, buying Britain the time Churchill knew was essential. Another vital aspect of Churchill's plan began to take shape, turning Britain into the world's arsenal of resistance. He immediately dispatched diplomatic missions to secure industrial contracts in the United States, knowing that British factories alone could not sustain the war effort. Though America remained neutral, Churchill understood President Roosevelt's sympathies and the American public's growing unease with Germany's aggression. He mastered the art of appealing not just to Roosevelt's politics, but to his sense of destiny. The seeds of Lend-Lease, which would later supply Britain with weapons, food and materials on a staggering scale, were planted during these early exchanges. Churchill's hidden strategy depended on making Britain indispensable to America's future, ensuring the United States could not ignore the growing threat overseas. When France fell and Hitler confidently offered peace terms, Churchill rejected them without hesitation. Many in his cabinet believed this was madness, that Britain, isolated and militarily fragile, could not survive. But Churchill understood the psychological battlefield better than any of them. Accepting peace would validate Hitler's expansion, embolden his ambitions, and leave Britain subordinate to a totalitarian empire. Rejecting peace, however, would force Hitler into a prolonged war he could not sustain. The dictator, blinded by early victories, believed crushing Britain would be simple. Churchill knew otherwise. With that single refusal, he committed Britain to a course that would eventually destroy the Third Reich, not through overwhelming force but through persistence, deception, alliances, and the unsustainable weight of Hitler's own hatred. To the world, the Battle of Britain appeared to be a contest of aircraft and pilot skill, a duel between Spitfires and Messerschmitts in the skies above the English Channel. But beneath the aerial combat lay a deeper, hidden struggle shaped directly by Churchill's strategy. He understood that if Germany gained control of the air, invasion would follow and Britain's ability to endure would collapse. Thus, the battle was not merely about defending territory, it was about defending time itself. Churchill's early insistence on radar development, once ridiculed, now proved decisive. The chain of radar stations along the coast became the nervous system of Britain's air defense, giving commanders precious minutes to intercept incoming raids. Few civilians realized that their survival depended on calculations occurring in dusty coastal stations staffed by young women studying trembling radio waves. Inside the cabinet war rooms beneath Whitehall, Churchill directed the air campaign with unrelenting focus. He spent hours poring over maps, losses, and intelligence reports. His relationship with Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, leader of Fighter Command, was complex, sometimes strained, sometimes admiring, but ultimately anchored in mutual necessity. Dowding's defensive strategy, prioritizing preservation of aircraft and pilots, aligned perfectly with Churchill's doctrine of endurance. While others demanded aggressive counterattacks across the Channel, Churchill supported Dowding's more cautious approach. He knew that Britain could not afford reckless losses. The goal was not to destroy the Luftwaffe outright, but to survive its assault long enough for Germany's strategic impatience to fracture. Churchill made another vital decision, to keep the British public fully informed of the danger, yet never despairing. His speeches walked a tightrope, acknowledging losses while elevating courage. When he spoke of the few, he transformed fighter pilots into mythic guardians, symbols of national will. This was not mere rhetoric. Churchill understood that morale itself was a weapon, a psychological force Germany could not quantify. Hitler believed terror bombing would shatter British resolve, but Churchill believed the opposite, that shared suffering could unify a democracy more powerfully than fear. When Londoners endured nightly raids, emerging from shelters covered in dust and grit, they were living proof of his strategy. Their endurance became a battlefield Hitler had never anticipated. Behind the scenes, Churchill authorized a series of intelligence operations designed to distort German perceptions of British strength. MI5 and MI6 fed misinformation through double agents, creating the illusion of superior fighter reserves and falsely suggesting that British factories were producing aircraft at astonishing rates. Part of this was true. British production did increase dramatically, but the scale was exaggerated to manipulate German planning. Hitler, relying on flawed Luftwaffe intelligence, believed Britain's fighter command was on the brink of collapse, then inexplicably recovering. This confusion contributed to one of the greatest strategic blunders of the war, the switch from attacking airfields to bombing cities. Churchill recognized the shift as a gift, one paid for in blood but decisive nonetheless. The airfields were spared just long enough for Britain to rebuild. Churchill also played a quiet but critical role in strengthening the bond between civilians and the military. He toured bombed neighborhoods, walking among rubble while crowds gathered around him. These appearances were not staged performances, they were calculated acts of solidarity. Photographs of Churchill in the ruins of East London had a psychological impact immeasurable in strategic terms. They conveyed a message to both Britons and Germans, that the nation's leader was not hiding in bunkers, that he shared the danger, and that Britain would not break. Hitler, misinterpreting this resilience as stubbornness rather than strategic unity, intensified the bombing campaign, a choice that drained German resources while hardening British resolve. As the skies filled with contrails and fire, Churchill began preparing for the next phase of his hidden strategy, globalizing the conflict. He knew that if Germany focused its full power on Britain alone, the island could survive for a time, but not indefinitely. The key was forcing Hitler to expand the war prematurely. If the dictator directed his armies toward the Soviet Union or North Africa before finishing Britain, the German war machine would be stretched across vast theaters it could not supply. Churchill encouraged this overextension subtly, studying Hitler's ideological blind spots. He understood that Hitler's hatred for Bolshevism would eventually drive him east, and he waited patiently for that fatal decision. The Battle of Britain officially ended in October 1940, but in Churchill's eyes, the true victory was not the preservation of air superiority. It was the preservation of British confidence. The nation had endured its first major test, and by surviving, it had shattered Hitler's expectation of a quick victory. This defied every principle on which the Nazi war plan rested. Germany's economy, military structure, and supply chains were designed for rapid conquest, not prolonged conflict. By foiling the invasion and forcing Hitler into a war of attrition, Churchill had set the dictator on a path toward disaster. With the skies secure, Churchill shifted focus once more, building alliances, sustaining morale, and preparing for a global war that would likely last years. His hidden strategy was no longer theoretical, it was in motion. Britain stood alone because Churchill believed standing alone was the only way to reshape the war's trajectory. And now that the nation had survived the deadliest air campaign in history, Germany would be compelled to divert its attention elsewhere. The next phase of the conflict would be fought not only on battlefields, but in the corridors of diplomacy, the factories of America, and the halls of Soviet leadership. Churchill's plan was unfolding exactly as he had foreseen, a war of endurance that Hitler had never expected. When the Blitz descended upon Britain in late 1940, it unleashed one of the most relentless civilian bombardments in modern history. London burned night after night, its skyline lit by infernos that devoured entire streets. Yet Churchill saw in this destruction not simply tragedy, but transformation. The Blitz, in all its horror, forged a unity in Britain that had never existed before. The British people, once divided by class, politics, and regional identity, were now bound together in shared peril. Churchill seized upon this moment to reinforce the moral core of his hidden strategy, showing the world that democracies could endure suffering with dignity. This would become one of the most decisive psychological victories of the war. Hitler expected panic. Churchill delivered resilience. Churchill's wartime leadership during the Blitz was defined by proximity. He refused to retreat to the countryside or remain hidden in deep shelters. Instead, he traveled across London during air raids, climbing into bombed buildings, walking through smoke-filled streets, and speaking with survivors. These visits were far more than symbolic gestures. They were acts of strategic communication. The presence of the Prime Minister in the ruins was a message broadcast across Britain, that no citizen stood alone. When people saw Churchill amid the rubble, hat dusted with ash, it reinforced their belief that endurance was possible. And when German intelligence reported that morale remained inexplicably high despite the devastation, Hitler became increasingly infuriated and increasingly reckless. The Luftwaffe's goal was clear: break Britain's civilian will and force the government to negotiate peace. But Churchill understood something Hitler never grasped, that bombing civilians could strengthen political resolve rather than weaken it. British newspapers printed photographs of ruined churches and burning streets not to demoralize readers, but to galvanize them. Churchill encouraged the dissemination of images that highlighted both destruction and bravery. Firefighters fighting flames in St. Paul's Cathedral, milkmen delivering bottles through shattered streets, children carrying gas masks to school, these scenes became icons of the nation's iron soul. Germany believed terror would fracture the British spirit. Instead, Churchill turned terror into fuel. Behind the scenes, Churchill orchestrated one of the most advanced civil defense systems of the war. He expanded the Air Raid Precautions Service, trained thousands of wardens, and oversaw the development of shelters in underground stations. He directed the Ministry of Information to produce educational films teaching civilians how to survive bombings. By mobilizing millions of ordinary Britons into wartime roles, from stretcher-bearers to firefighters to codebreakers, Churchill transformed the home front into an active battlefield. Every citizen became a participant in the war effort. Hitler had never anticipated a nation in which civilians would fight, psychologically and practically, with the same determination as soldiers. The Blitz also played a crucial role in strengthening Britain's global position. Churchill knew that photographs of London in flames, yet unbowed, would resonate deeply in the United States. American public opinion, still wary of foreign entanglements, shifted dramatically as images of British civilians enduring nightly terror filled newspapers. Churchill cultivated this shift carefully, sending personal messages to Roosevelt that blended strategic necessity with emotional appeal. He framed Britain not as a distant empire fighting for power, but as a democratic beacon resisting tyranny. The Blitz, horrific though it was, gave Churchill the moral narrative he needed to persuade America that its future was tied to Britain's survival. In strategic terms, the Blitz had an unintended consequence that Churchill recognized early. It stretched Germany's resources thin. Bombing campaigns demanded massive amounts of fuel, aircraft, spare parts, and trained pilots. The Luftwaffe's shift to nighttime raids required new tactics and strained Hitler's industrial base. Churchill knew Germany could not sustain such operations indefinitely, especially with the Soviet Union looming as a potential battlefield. Thus, every bomb dropped on London was also a bomb dropped on Germany's long-term strategic reserves. Churchill grimly accepted the suffering of the Blitz because he understood the larger calculus. Britain was trading destroyed buildings for Germany's future exhaustion. The turning point came when Hitler expanded the Blitz to provincial cities. Coventry, Liverpool, Birmingham, and other industrial centers were targeted relentlessly. Churchill's response was swift and resolute. He ordered factories dispersed across the country, moved key production underground, and increased redundancy in supply chains. This decentralization meant that even catastrophic strikes could not cripple manufacturing entirely. Germany believed it was destroying Britain's industrial backbone. Churchill ensured the backbone grew stronger, more adaptable, and more invisible with each attack. Once again, Hitler's assumptions about democracies, slow, fragile, disorganized, proved disastrously incorrect. By the time the Blitz ended in May 1941, Britain had paid a terrible price in lives and infrastructure. Yet the campaign had achieved the opposite of what Hitler intended. Britain had become a nation forged by fire, unified in purpose, and convinced of the righteousness of its cause. Churchill's hidden strategy, endurance, misdirection, psychological fortification, and global appeal, had endured its most severe test. The Germans had failed to break Britain. And in their frustration, they would soon make the decision Churchill had been waiting for since the beginning of the war, to attack the Soviet Union, opening the vast Eastern Front that would ultimately lead to Germany's destruction. Hitler believed he was expanding his empire. In reality, he was stepping into the trap Churchill had anticipated years before. When Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, he believed he was embarking on the decisive campaign that would secure his empire for generations. To Churchill, however, the invasion of the Soviet Union was not a stunning surprise. It was the moment he had foreseen long before the war began. His analysis of Hitler's ideology convinced him that the dictator's hatred for Bolshevism would eventually compel him to destroy the USSR, regardless of strategic logic. Churchill understood that Hitler's worldview was more potent than his military planning. And in that fatal blend of ideology and ambition, Churchill recognized a vulnerability that could crack the entire Nazi regime. When news of the invasion reached London, Churchill is said to have nodded gravely, not in relief but in acknowledgement. The war had entered the phase he had predicted and prepared for. Churchill knew that Germany was unprepared for a prolonged war on two fronts. Though the Wehrmacht was formidable, its logistics were fragile, its supply lines vulnerable, and its economic base insufficient for sustained operations across the vast Soviet landscape. Hitler believed the campaign would last mere months. Churchill knew otherwise. He understood that the vastness of Russia, the harshness of its winters, and the resilience of its people would grind the German war machine into exhaustion. But the key to success lay in ensuring the Soviet Union did not collapse in the critical early stages. Thus, Churchill made a decision that shocked many. He offered immediate support to Joseph Stalin, a dictator he despised, leading a regime he considered monstrous. Yet Churchill grasped the strategic necessity. Only an alliance between the British Empire, the United States, and the Soviet Union could defeat Nazi Germany. Churchill's speeches following the invasion were extraordinary examples of his ability to reframe global politics. In one of his most famous addresses, he declared that any opponent of Hitler was an ally of Britain, no matter how abhorrent their ideology. This was not moral compromise, it was strategic realism. The alliance with the Soviet Union allowed Churchill to globalize the conflict further, transforming it into a vast ideological struggle not between nations, but between freedom and tyranny. Hitler, who had hoped to isolate Britain after the fall of France, suddenly found himself at war with the world's largest nation, with Britain acting as the diplomatic bridge that connected East and West. Behind closed doors, Churchill began crafting a supply strategy that would keep the Soviet Union in the fight. He dispatched ships through the treacherous Arctic convoys, carrying tanks, aircraft, and supplies to Murmansk and Archangel. These missions were extraordinarily dangerous, threatened by U-boats, Luftwaffe bombers, and the brutal conditions of the northern seas. Yet Churchill insisted the convoys continue, even when losses were high. He understood that each shipment reaching the Soviet front lines extended the war for Hitler, forcing Germany to pour men and machines into a vast, unforgiving arena. The longer the Eastern Front endured, the sooner Hitler's empire would collapse under the weight of his own ambition. Churchill also worked relentlessly to secure deeper American involvement. Roosevelt, increasingly sympathetic to Britain, used the invasion of the USSR as further justification for expanding Lend-Lease. Churchill skillfully appealed to America's sense of moral responsibility while emphasizing the global threat Germany posed. He argued that supporting both Britain and the Soviet Union was essential not for territorial interests, but for the preservation of democratic values worldwide. This framing resonated deeply with Roosevelt, who saw history turning toward a decisive moment. Through Churchill's diplomacy, the British Empire became the linchpin of an unprecedented alliance, one that Hitler never expected and could not counter. The Eastern Front soon became a brutal battleground unlike anything the world had seen. Millions of soldiers clashed in a conflict marked by unimaginable suffering. Churchill followed the battles closely, analyzing German withdrawals, supply shortages, and the disastrous impact of winter on the Wehrmacht. He recognized the significance of each Soviet victory, not only for Russia but for the entire Allied cause. As German casualties mounted, Churchill observed a shift in the balance of power. Hitler, who had once seemed undefeatable, was now trapped in a war of attrition he himself had chosen, exactly the kind of war Churchill's strategy aimed to create. Yet Churchill remained cautious. He knew that even a wounded Germany was dangerous, capable of launching devastating offensives and producing advanced weaponry. His role was to maintain pressure on all fronts, ensuring Germany could not consolidate its forces. He intensified bombing campaigns in Western Europe, targeted industrial centers essential to the German war effort, and encouraged resistance movements in occupied countries. Every action was part of a larger mosaic, weakening Germany incrementally while strengthening the Allied coalition. Hitler believed he could defeat his enemies sequentially. Churchill ensured the enemies advanced together. Operation Barbarossa marked the beginning of Hitler's downfall, but it also marked the moment Churchill's hidden strategy became fully visible. By forcing Germany into a long multi-front war it could not sustain, Churchill turned Hitler's greatest strengths, speed, aggression, and ambition, into fatal weaknesses. The dictator had expected Britain to break. Instead, Britain endured, resisted, and rallied the world. And now, as the Eastern Front consumed German lives and resources, Churchill's ultimate vision began to take shape. A global coalition that would surround Germany from all sides and crush it through overwhelming, coordinated pressure. Hitler had unleashed the largest invasion in history, but in doing so, he had walked straight into the trap Churchill had spent years preparing. By 1942, Churchill understood that Britain's survival depended as much on the Atlantic Ocean as on any battlefield in Europe. German U-boats prowled the waters like silent predators, threatening the supply lines that fed, armed, and equipped the British Isles. The Battle of the Atlantic became one of the war's most critical theaters, though it lacked the dramatic imagery of land battles and air raids. Churchill later wrote that the U-boat threat was the only danger that truly frightened him. Without American supplies, British endurance would collapse, and the entire strategic framework he had built would crumble. Thus, securing the Atlantic lifeline became a matter not only of naval warfare, but of diplomacy, technology, and global coordination. Churchill worked tirelessly to strengthen Britain's naval capabilities. He pushed for accelerated production of escort ships, convoy systems, and anti-submarine technology such as sonar, ASTIC, and improved depth charges. His focus was relentless. Convoys were to be protected at all costs. He also oversaw the development of long-range patrol aircraft capable of hunting U-boats in previously unreachable areas of the ocean. The Air Ministry, Admiralty, and intelligence services were forced into unprecedented cooperation. Churchill demanded it, believing that only an integrated approach could outmaneuver the German wolf packs. His strategic vision transformed the Atlantic from a death trap into a battleground where technology and coordination slowly tilted the balance. Intelligence played a decisive role in this phase of the war. The breaking of the German Enigma code at Bletchley Park allowed Britain to intercept U-boat communications, track their movements, and reroute convoys around danger zones. Churchill, informed daily of these decrypts, often acted with astonishing speed, shifting naval assets and adjusting convoy routes based on information only a handful of people in the world possessed. The secrecy surrounding ultra-intelligence was absolute. Churchill protected it with fierce determination. He knew that if Germany discovered the code had been cracked, the advantage would disappear instantly. Thus, even when U-boats attacked convoys whose positions Britain knew, Churchill often allowed the attacks to occur to preserve the secret. It was a grim calculus, but one he believed necessary for long-term victory. Churchill's diplomacy with the United States intensified during this period. Though America had entered the war after Pearl Harbor, integrating American industrial might, naval power, and manpower into Allied strategy required careful coordination. Churchill traveled repeatedly to Washington, forging a personal bond with Roosevelt that became one of the most important relationships of the war. Their meetings produced the Germany First strategy, which prioritized defeating Hitler before turning full attention to Japan. This alignment was crucial. Without it, Allied resources might have been divided, Germany might have stabilized the Eastern Front, and the war's outcome could have shifted dramatically. Churchill understood that victory required unity, not only of purpose but of prioritization. The struggle in the Atlantic was not limited to military action. It was also a psychological battle. Churchill needed to convince the British public that victory at sea was achievable despite heavy losses. Ships disappeared without warning and entire convoys were annihilated. Yet Churchill maintained a balance between honesty and reassurance. He acknowledged the dangers while emphasizing technological progress and operational successes. His speeches conveyed not despair, but determination. He framed the struggle as a test of national fortitude, a theme consistent with his broader strategy of endurance. By presenting the Battle of the Atlantic as a shared national endeavor, he strengthened domestic support for the prolonged effort required to defeat the U-boat menace. In 1943, the tide of the Atlantic battle finally turned decisively in the Allies' favor. Improved radar, long-range aircraft, escort carriers, and increasingly effective intelligence transformed the ocean into hostile territory for U-boats. German losses skyrocketed. Churchill recognized the significance immediately. With the Atlantic secured, Britain's industrial and military capabilities expanded dramatically. Supplies flowed freely from America, enabling larger bombing campaigns, the buildup of forces for future invasions, and the continuation of support to the Soviet Union. The ocean, once a graveyard of ships, had become the artery of Allied power. Churchill's insistence on prioritizing the Atlantic had proven essential. Yet Churchill saw beyond the immediate military benefits. The strengthening of transatlantic ties created a foundation for the post-war world. He envisioned a partnership between Britain and the United States that would shape global politics for decades. His speeches increasingly referenced the special relationship, a term he coined to describe the unique bond he believed essential for maintaining peace after Hitler's defeat. This was not mere sentimentality. It was geopolitical foresight. Churchill understood that the war was reshaping the global order, and he intended for Britain to emerge with influence preserved through cooperation rather than unilateral power. By the end of 1943, the Atlantic lifeline was no longer a symbol of Britain's vulnerability, it was a symbol of Allied strength. Churchill's strategic vision had transformed a perilous theater into a foundation for future offensives. With the ocean secured, he turned his attention once more to the broader war. The air campaign over Germany, the battles in North Africa and Italy, and the long-awaited invasion of Western Europe. The global chessboard Churchill had envisioned before the war was revealing its final pattern. Hitler's empire was surrounded, stretched, and weakening. The trap was closing. And Churchill, watching each piece fall into place, prepared for the next phase of his hidden strategy, overwhelming the Third Reich through simultaneous pressure on every front. The North African campaign marked a crucial transition in Churchill's strategy, from endurance to counteroffensive. After years of defensive struggle, Britain finally had the opportunity to strike a blow against Germany on land. Churchill recognized North Africa's strategic importance early in the war. Control of the Suez Canal meant control of vital shipping routes that linked Britain to its empire in India, Australia, and beyond. Losing it would have severed Britain's global lifeline. Thus, North Africa was not merely a colonial front, it was a fulcrum on which the war's momentum could pivot. Churchill understood that victory in the desert would send a powerful message to both allies and enemies. Britain was capable not only of surviving but of fighting back. The arrival of Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, turned the North African campaign into a contest of wits and logistics. Rommel's daring tactics, rapid maneuvers, and ability to turn small advantages into sweeping offensives challenged British forces relentlessly. Churchill followed Rommel's movements with intense interest, recognizing in him a formidable adversary. Yet he also saw Rommel's weakness, reliance on long supply lines stretching back to Italy and vulnerable to Allied naval and air interdiction. Churchill's strategy in North Africa became one of strangulation, weakening Rommel's resources until his battlefield brilliance could no longer compensate for shortages in fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements. Churchill made bold decisions to reinforce the campaign. He dispatched the Eighth Army's best commanders, including General Claude Auchinleck and later Bernard Montgomery, ensuring the desert forces had strong leadership. He also pushed for increased tank production and prioritized shipments to North Africa even when other theaters desperately needed supplies. Critics accused him of gambling. But Churchill believed the desert offered the best opportunity to reverse German momentum. A British victory there would not only secure the Middle East but also boost morale across the empire, showing that Axis forces could be defeated on land, something that had not yet been achieved since the war began. The turning point came at El Alamein in late 1942. Churchill, visiting the front days before the offensive, sensed a shift in British confidence. Montgomery's rigorous training regimen, improved equipment, and disciplined formations had transformed the Eighth Army into a formidable fighting force. Churchill later wrote that he felt the tension of destiny in the air. When the battle began, waves of artillery fire and tank assaults hammered German-Italian positions. Rommel's forces, stretched thin and reliant on dwindling supplies, fought fiercely but could not withstand the coordinated Allied assault. El Alamein became the first major British land victory of the war, a triumph Churchill celebrated with characteristic eloquence. Churchill famously declared after the victory, "This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is, perhaps, the end of the beginning." These words encapsulated a critical shift in the war. For the first time, the momentum had decisively turned against Hitler's forces. The psychological impact was immense. Hitler, who had built his empire on the myth of invincibility, now faced undeniable proof that his armies could be beaten. Meanwhile, the British public, weary from years of bombing and sacrifice, saw in El Alamein a symbol of hope and renewal. Churchill's hidden strategy had always depended on sustaining morale until a major victory could validate the long struggle. El Alamein provided that validation. The victory also transformed diplomatic dynamics. The United States, newly engaged in global operations, viewed Britain's triumph as evidence of British military competence. This strengthened Churchill's position in negotiations with Roosevelt and helped shape joint planning for future operations, including the invasion of Italy. The Soviet Union, fighting bitterly on the Eastern Front, also recognized the importance of the North African victory. Churchill's commitment to opening secondary fronts, even if they did not immediately relieve pressure on the Soviets, demonstrated that Britain was fighting everywhere possible. The global alliance Churchill had envisioned was becoming stronger and more coordinated. After pursuing Rommel's retreating forces across North Africa, the Allies achieved complete victory in the theater by 1943. Churchill saw this not merely as a territorial win, but as a strategic watershed. North Africa had forced Germany to divert troops, tanks, and aircraft from the Eastern Front. It had exposed the vulnerabilities in Hitler's command structure and highlighted the growing strength of Allied coordination. Most importantly, it provided a staging ground for future operations in southern Europe. Churchill had long advocated for attacking Europe through its soft underbelly, a strategy that would soon lead to the invasion of Sicily and Italy. North Africa was the gateway to this phase of the war. In the aftermath of the North African campaign, Churchill reflected on how closely the outcome aligned with his long-term vision. The desert had tested every element of his hidden strategy: endurance, deception, alliance building, and global mobilization. The victory proved that the Allies could take the offensive and win decisively. It also underscored the central principle of Churchill's wartime leadership: that Hitler's empire, though vast and powerful, was riddled with vulnerabilities waiting to be exploited. North Africa showed the world that those vulnerabilities could be transformed into defeats. And Churchill, seeing the path ahead more clearly than ever, prepared to carry the war back into the heart of Europe. The invasion of Sicily in 1943 marked the beginning of a bold new phase in Churchill's strategy: the assault on Hitler's soft underbelly. Churchill had long believed that Italy represented the most vulnerable entry point into Axis-held Europe. While many American generals favored a direct cross-channel invasion, Churchill argued that striking Italy first would force Germany to divert troops from the Eastern Front, weaken Axis cohesion, and destabilize Mussolini's regime. His strategic reasoning was based on geography, politics, and the psychology of dictatorships. Italy was militarily weaker than Germany, internally divided, and geographically exposed. A successful campaign there would shake Axis confidence while opening a new corridor into the continent. Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily, was one of the largest amphibious assaults in history up to that point. Churchill monitored the operation with intense interest, understanding that its success would validate his southern strategy. The campaign exposed weaknesses in Axis coordination. German and Italian forces struggled to mount a unified defense, hampered by poor communication and conflicting priorities. Churchill knew these fractures could be exploited. As Allied forces advanced across the island, Mussolini's authority crumbled. The Italian people, exhausted by years of war and disillusioned with their leadership, began demanding change. Churchill recognized that Italy was not merely a battlefield, it was a political fault line within the Axis alliance. The collapse of Mussolini's government soon followed. In July 1943, the Fascist Grand Council voted to remove him from power. Churchill understood the significance immediately. Italy, the first member of the Axis alliance, had fallen from within. This was not only a military victory but a psychological and diplomatic triumph. Hitler, enraged by the betrayal, was forced to divert German troops to occupy Italy and prevent its defection to the Allies. Churchill's strategy had worked. Germany's resources were stretched even thinner, its alliances weakened, its confidence shaken. The pressure on all fronts was growing, and the trap Churchill had long envisioned was tightening. The Italian mainland, however, presented formidable challenges. The geography favored defenders, with mountains, rivers, and narrow passes slowing the Allied advance. German forces under Field Marshal Albert Kesselring entrenched themselves in defensive lines that proved difficult to penetrate. Churchill followed these battles closely, often growing frustrated at the slow pace of the campaign. Yet he also understood that every German soldier fighting in Italy was one less fighting in Russia or defending France. The Italian theater served as a strategic sponge, absorbing German manpower and material. Churchill's long war philosophy emphasized cumulative pressure rather than rapid breakthroughs. Italy was the embodiment of that principle. Operation Avalanche, the landings at Salerno, and the subsequent push northward were marked by fierce fighting and heavy casualties. Churchill traveled frequently to the Mediterranean theater, meeting commanders, inspecting troops, and studying the terrain firsthand. His presence was both motivational and strategic. He believed leadership required visibility, especially in difficult campaigns. His visits reassured commanders that the Mediterranean front remained a high priority. He also used these trips to strengthen diplomatic ties with local leaders, ensuring political stability in liberated regions. For Churchill, the Italian campaign was not just about defeating German forces, it was about shaping post-war Europe. One of the most significant outcomes of the Italian campaign was the opening of air bases within striking distance of German industrial heartlands. From Italy, the Allies could launch bombing missions deep into Eastern Europe, disrupting supply lines, destroying factories, and weakening Germany's operational capacity. Churchill understood the importance of air power in the modern era. He believed that strategic bombing could cripple Germany's ability to wage war long before the ground forces reached Berlin. Italy provided the launch pad for this aerial offensive, extending the reach of Allied bombers and increasing the pressure on Germany's already strained resources. Italy also played a crucial role in weakening Axis unity. The Italian resistance, emboldened by Allied advances, sabotaged German supply lines, gathered intelligence and conducted guerrilla operations across the country. Churchill supported these movements through covert operations, weapons deliveries and coordination with local leaders. The resistance efforts forced Germany to devote troops to security duties, further draining its combat strength. Churchill saw these actions as essential components of his larger strategy, eroding the Axis from within while Allied forces attacked from without. Every act of resistance shortened the war by weakening German control over occupied territories. By the end of 1944, the Italian campaign had achieved Churchill's strategic goals. Germany was fighting on multiple fronts, its alliances were fractured, and its southern defenses were collapsing. Though the fighting in Italy was slow and costly, it contributed significantly to the overall weakening of the Nazi war effort. Churchill's belief in attacking the periphery before the center had proven effective. Italy had been the soft underbelly he predicted, and its fall paved the way for future Allied advances into Central Europe. As Churchill looked toward the next phase of the war, the liberation of France, he understood that the cumulative pressure on all fronts was bringing Hitler's empire to the brink of collapse. The planning of Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy, was the culmination of years of strategic positioning. Churchill had always known that a cross-channel invasion would be necessary to defeat Hitler. His southern strategy in North Africa and Italy had set the stage, weakening Germany's periphery and stretching its forces thin. Now, with the Soviet Union pressing from the east and Allied bombers striking German industry relentlessly, Churchill believed the time had come to open the long-awaited Western Front. He understood that this invasion would determine the fate of the war. Success would lead to the liberation of Europe. Failure would risk prolonging the conflict indefinitely. The stakes could not have been higher. Churchill threw himself into the planning process with characteristic intensity. He scrutinized landing sites, debated logistical constraints, and questioned every assumption made by the planners. His primary concern was the weather and the unpredictability of the English Channel. He feared that high winds, rough seas, or poor visibility could doom the invasion. Yet he also understood that Overlord had to proceed despite the risks. The timing was dictated by multiple factors: the phases of the moon, the tides, the availability of landing craft, and the operational readiness of American, British, and Canadian forces. Churchill, ever aware of the delicate balance, pushed for meticulous preparation while acknowledging the need for bold action. One of the most remarkable aspects of Overlord was the deception campaign known as Operation Fortitude. Churchill fully supported this effort, recognizing it as a masterpiece of strategic misdirection. Through fake radio traffic, inflatable tanks, double agents, and false intelligence, the Allies convinced the Germans that the invasion would occur at Pas-de-Calais, the shortest crossing between Britain and France. Churchill admired the ingenuity of this deception. It aligned perfectly with his broader strategy of using psychological warfare to manipulate enemy decisions. The success of Operation Fortitude ensured that German forces were concentrated far from Normandy when the real invasion began. On June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in history commenced. Churchill monitored the unfolding operation from the safety of London, though he longed to be with the troops. At one point he even requested permission to sail with the invasion fleet, a proposal that horrified his generals and the king. Ultimately, he agreed to remain in London, recognizing that the nation needed its leader alive. As reports streamed in, Churchill was relieved to learn that the landings on Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches had succeeded. The cost was high, especially for American forces at Omaha, but the beachheads were secured. The Western Front had been opened, and Hitler's strategic nightmare was becoming reality. Churchill understood that the invasion alone would not guarantee victory. The subsequent breakout from Normandy proved difficult and costly. The dense hedgerows of the French countryside provided excellent defensive positions for German forces. Churchill followed the battles closely, urging commanders to maintain momentum while acknowledging the operational challenges. He recognized that the success of the campaign depended on coordination between land, air, and naval forces. Allied air supremacy played a crucial role, allowing bombers and fighter aircraft to disrupt German movements and supply lines. Churchill saw this as validation of his long-held belief in the power of air support in modern warfare. As the Allies advanced through France, the political implications became increasingly significant. Churchill sought to ensure that France's liberation would be conducted in a manner that preserved French sovereignty and prevented post-war instability. He supported Charles de Gaulle as the leader of the Free French forces, despite their often contentious relationship. Churchill believed that a strong France was essential for the balance of power in post-war Europe. His efforts ensured that the French played a prominent role in the liberation of their own country, reinforcing the legitimacy of their government and strengthening Allied unity. The liberation of Paris in August 1944 was a moment of profound significance. Churchill viewed it as more than a symbolic victory. It marked the collapse of German control in Western Europe and demonstrated the strength of the Allied coalition. As Paris celebrated its freedom, Churchill reflected on the long journey from the dark days of 1940, when Britain had stood alone against the Nazi threat. Now the Allies were marching through the heart of France, pushing inexorably toward Germany. The success of D-Day and the subsequent campaigns validated Churchill's belief in a long, coordinated effort that combined diplomacy, endurance, and military power. By the end of 1944, the Western Front had become a relentless advance toward the Rhine. Churchill understood that the end of the war was approaching, but he also remained vigilant. He knew that Hitler was capable of desperate measures, and he cautioned against complacency. The Battle of the Bulge, which erupted in December, confirmed his fears. Yet the Allies, strengthened by their unity and logistical superiority, repelled the German offensive. Churchill's hidden strategy, surviving long enough to build an overwhelming coalition, had succeeded. Germany was cornered, its forces depleted, its morale shattered. The end was near, and Churchill prepared for the final phase of the war. As 1945 began, Churchill understood that the war was entering its decisive stage. The Allies were closing in on Germany from all sides. The Soviet Union was advancing from the east, exacting a brutal revenge for the devastation inflicted on their homeland. American and British forces were pushing from the west, liberating concentration camps, seizing industrial centers, and crossing the Rhine. Churchill followed these developments with a mixture of triumph and apprehension. He knew that victory was inevitable, but he also recognized that the post-war settlement would shape the world for generations. The challenge was no longer defeating Hitler, it was preventing the emergence of new threats in his absence. Churchill's leadership during this period was characterized by both strategic focus and philosophical reflection. He met frequently with Roosevelt and Stalin, navigating the complex dynamics of the Big Three alliance. Each leader had different visions for the post-war world. Churchill sought to preserve the British Empire, maintain balance in Europe, and prevent Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. Roosevelt aimed to establish a system of international cooperation through the United Nations. Stalin, driven by insecurity and ambition, sought to expand Soviet influence across Eastern Europe. Churchill understood the stakes of these negotiations. The war had united these leaders, but the peace could easily divide them. The Yalta Conference in February 1945 became a turning point in these discussions. Churchill arrived with a clear agenda: secure free elections in liberated countries, establish spheres of influence that preserved British interests, and limit Soviet expansion. Yet the military realities constrained his bargaining power. The Red Army controlled much of Eastern Europe, and the Western Allies had not yet crossed into Germany. Churchill was forced to compromise, accepting agreements that he found troubling but unavoidable. He later expressed regret that the balance of power had shifted so dramatically. Yet he also recognized that the war had fundamentally altered the global order, and Britain could no longer dictate terms unilaterally. Despite the political tensions, military cooperation remained strong. Churchill closely monitored the final offensives into Germany, celebrating each victory while mourning the immense human cost. The liberation of concentration camps shocked him deeply. He had known of Nazi atrocities, but the scale and horror surpassed anything he had imagined. The revelation of these crimes strengthened Churchill's resolve to ensure that Hitler's regime was not only defeated but utterly dismantled. He supported the prosecution of war criminals and the denazification of German institutions. For Churchill, victory was not merely a military objective, it was a moral imperative. As Allied forces advanced toward Berlin, Churchill faced pressure from some military leaders to outrun the Soviets and seize the German capital. He resisted these calls, recognizing that the political implications could be disastrous. The agreements made at Yalta had established spheres of influence, and violating them risked sparking conflict with the Soviet Union. Churchill understood that cooperation among the Allies, however fragile, was essential to maintaining global stability. He believed that a divided Berlin, overseen by all three powers, would serve as a symbol of unity and prevent unilateral domination. This decision, though controversial, reflected Churchill's broader vision of a post-war order based on balance and cooperation. Hitler's suicide in April 1945 signaled the final collapse of the Nazi regime. Churchill viewed the moment with a complex mixture of satisfaction and solemnity. The man who had plunged the world into chaos was gone, but the damage he had inflicted would take generations to repair. Churchill remained focused on the practical challenges ahead, rebuilding Europe, supporting liberated nations, and preventing the spread of totalitarianism. He believed that the lessons of the war must be preserved, not only in policy but in collective memory. The world, he argued, must remember the cost of tyranny and the importance of resistance. On May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, Churchill addressed the nation with a mixture of pride and humility. He praised the courage of the British people, the valor of the armed forces, and the strength of the Allied coalition. Yet he also reminded the nation that the war was not yet over. Japan remained a formidable enemy, and the global struggle for peace was only beginning. Churchill's speech reflected his deep understanding of history. He knew that the end of one conflict often sowed the seeds of the next. His focus shifted from military victory to political leadership in the emerging post-war world. As Europe celebrated victory, Churchill looked toward the future with both hope and caution. He envisioned a world united by shared values, strengthened by alliances, and protected by international institutions. Yet he also saw the dangers posed by ideological divisions, particularly between the Soviet Union and the Western democracies. Churchill's strategic genius had guided Britain through its darkest hour, but now he faced a new challenge: navigating a world reshaped by war, where the lines between allies and adversaries were shifting once again. The hidden strategy that had defeated Hitler now had to evolve into a vision for peace. The end of the war in Europe did not bring the sense of closure Churchill had hoped for. Instead, it ushered in a new era of uncertainty. As the Soviet Union consolidated its control over Eastern Europe, Churchill sensed the emergence of a new threat. He had always distrusted Stalin, viewing him as a ruthless dictator driven by ideological fervor. Now, the Red Army's occupation of Poland, Hungary, Romania, and East Germany confirmed his fears. Churchill understood that the wartime alliance had been a marriage of necessity, not of principle. The bonds forged in the fight against Hitler were beginning to unravel, and a new ideological divide was taking shape across the continent. Churchill's concerns about Soviet expansion were not merely geopolitical. He feared that the values the Allies claimed to defend, freedom, democracy, and self-determination, were being compromised. He believed that the sacrifices made during the war demanded a future built on these principles. Yet he watched with frustration as Stalin installed puppet governments in Eastern Europe and suppressed any opposition. Churchill raised these concerns with both Roosevelt and Truman, emphasizing the need for a firm response. But with Roosevelt's declining health and eventual death, the leadership of the Allied coalition shifted, and Churchill found himself navigating a rapidly changing political landscape. The Potsdam Conference in July 1945 marked the beginning of the post-war order's political negotiations. Churchill attended the conference, but his position was weakened by the growing rift within his own government. The British general election coincided with the conference, and Churchill was forced to leave temporarily to campaign. When he returned, he learned that the Labour Party, led by Clement Attlee, had won a landslide victory. Churchill, the man who had led Britain through its darkest hour, was no longer Prime Minister. The political shift stunned him. He had expected to continue shaping the post-war world, but now he found himself sidelined at a moment of critical importance. Despite his electoral defeat, Churchill remained an influential figure on the world stage. In 1946, he traveled to Fulton, Missouri, to deliver a speech that would become one of the defining moments of the early Cold War. Standing beside President Truman, Churchill warned of an Iron Curtain descending across Europe. His words captured the emerging geopolitical reality with stark clarity. Churchill was not advocating confrontation but awareness. He believed that the Western democracies needed to recognize the threat posed by Soviet expansion and work together to counter it. His speech was controversial at the time, but history would prove his warning prophetic. Churchill's concern about the Soviet Union reflected his broader understanding of power and ideology. He believed that tyranny, regardless of its political orientation, posed a fundamental threat to freedom. While he acknowledged the Soviet Union's contribution to defeating Hitler, he also recognized that Stalin's ambitions extended beyond the war. Churchill advocated for a strong Western alliance, built on cooperation between Britain, the United States, and other democratic nations. He believed that only a united front could prevent future conflict. This vision laid the groundwork for institutions such as NATO, which would become essential pillars of the post-war order. In private, Churchill reflected on the challenges of transitioning from wartime leadership to peacetime politics. He understood that the qualities needed to win a war were not always the same as those needed to build a peace. His uncompromising stance, which had served Britain so well during the conflict, was now seen by some as inflexible. Yet Churchill believed that clarity was essential in the face of new threats. He continued to speak out against totalitarianism, using his influence to shape public opinion and encourage cooperation among Western nations. His voice, though no longer commanding armies, remained one of the most respected in the world. Churchill also recognized that the war had fundamentally changed the global balance of power. The British Empire, once the world's dominant force, was giving way to new superpowers. Churchill sought to manage this transition carefully, advocating for a strong commonwealth of nations that would maintain Britain's influence while respecting the aspirations of emerging states. He believed that the values that had guided Britain through the war, democracy, individual liberty, and global cooperation, should also guide the post-war world. His emphasis on these principles shaped the development of the international order and influenced generations of leaders. By the late 1940s, Churchill's warnings about the Soviet Union were increasingly validated by events. The Berlin blockade, the rise of communist movements in Eastern Europe, and the growing tension between East and West confirmed the existence of a new global struggle. Churchill's hidden strategy during the war, which had focused on endurance, alliance building, and resisting tyranny, evolved into a post-war vision of unity and vigilance. He understood that the fight for freedom did not end with Hitler's defeat. It continued in new forms, requiring the same determination and moral clarity that had carried Britain through the darkest days of the war. In 1951, Churchill returned to power as Prime Minister, leading the Conservative Party back into government. His second premiership was markedly different from his first. The war was over, the empire was changing, and Britain faced new challenges at home and abroad. Churchill, now in his late 70s, approached leadership with a mixture of determination and reflection. He recognized that the world had entered a new era, defined not by traditional warfare but by ideological conflict, nuclear weapons, and shifting alliances. His focus was no longer on defeating an external enemy but on preserving peace in an increasingly dangerous world. Churchill prioritized strengthening the Western alliance. He believed that unity among democratic nations was essential to preventing conflict with the Soviet Union. He supported the development of NATO and advocated for closer cooperation between Britain, the United States, and Western European countries. Churchill saw these alliances as the foundation for a stable and peaceful global order. He also encouraged European integration, though he viewed Britain's role as that of a supportive partner rather than a fully integrated member. His vision of a United States of Europe reflected his belief in the power of unity to prevent the recurrence of devastating wars. Domestically, Churchill faced significant challenges. Britain was struggling with post-war recovery, economic difficulties, and the gradual dismantling of its empire. Churchill sought to balance the need for economic stability with his commitment to social welfare programs. He recognized that the British people, who had endured years of sacrifice during the war, expected improvements in their quality of life. Churchill's leadership during this period was marked by pragmatism. He understood that Britain's future depended on rebuilding its economy, modernizing its industries, and adapting to the changing global landscape. Churchill's second term also saw significant developments in nuclear policy. He believed that nuclear weapons, while terrifying, could serve as a deterrent to war if managed responsibly. He supported nuclear research and worked closely with the United States to coordinate defense strategies. Churchill recognized the importance of balancing military strength with diplomatic engagement. He believed that maintaining open channels of communication with the Soviet Union was essential to preventing conflict. His approach reflected his broader philosophy: peace must be actively pursued, not merely hoped for. Despite his efforts, Churchill faced growing criticism. Some believed he was too focused on foreign policy and not attentive enough to domestic issues. Others felt that his leadership style, shaped by wartime necessity, was ill-suited to the complexities of peacetime. Yet Churchill remained committed to his vision. He believed that the lessons of the war must guide the decisions of the post-war era. He warned against complacency, emphasizing the need for vigilance in the face of new threats. His speeches during this period reflected a deep understanding of history and a profound concern for the future. Churchill's health began to decline during his second premiership. He suffered strokes that affected his speech and memory, though he continued to lead with determination. His colleagues and advisors often shielded him from the most demanding tasks, but Churchill refused to relinquish his responsibilities. He believed that his experience and judgment were essential to guiding Britain through this critical period. His resilience, even in the face of physical decline, reflected the same endurance that had defined his wartime leadership. In 1955, Churchill retired from office, marking the end of his political career. He left a legacy of leadership that had shaped the course of history. His departure was met with widespread admiration and respect. Churchill had guided Britain through its darkest hour, navigated the complexities of the post-war era, and laid the foundation for a new global order. Yet he also recognized the limits of his influence. The world was changing rapidly, and new leaders would need to carry the torch forward. His final years in office were a testament to his belief in the importance of continuity, cooperation, and the pursuit of peace. After leaving office, Churchill reflected on the arc of his life. He understood that his role in history was shaped not only by his successes but by the challenges he had overcome. He believed that leadership required courage, resilience, and a willingness to confront difficult truths. His experiences during the war had taught him that freedom was fragile and must be defended with vigilance. Churchill's final battle was not fought on the battlefield but in the realm of ideas. He used his remaining years to advocate for unity, peace, and cooperation among nations. His voice, though quieter than before, remained one of the most influential in the world. In his retirement, Churchill devoted himself to writing, painting, and reflecting on the extraordinary events he had witnessed. His war memoirs, published in multiple volumes, shaped the world's understanding of the conflict. Churchill believed that history was not merely a record of events but a guide for future generations. He sought to capture the complexities of leadership, the challenges of decision-making, and the moral dilemmas faced by those who stand at the crossroads of history. His writing was both personal and philosophical, offering insights into the nature of power, the fragility of democracy, and the importance of resilience. Churchill's paintings provided a different kind of solace. He often said that painting gave him a sense of tranquility that politics had never afforded. His landscapes, seascapes, and still lives reflected a man seeking peace after a lifetime of conflict. Churchill believed that creativity was essential to the human spirit, and he encouraged others to embrace artistic expression as a means of coping with adversity. His artistic pursuits revealed a softer side of his personality, one characterized by introspection, sensitivity, and a deep appreciation for beauty. Despite his retirement, Churchill remained a prominent figure in public life. He continued to speak on global issues, emphasizing the importance of international cooperation and the dangers of totalitarianism. His warnings about the Soviet Union, delivered with the clarity of someone who had confronted tyranny firsthand, resonated deeply with audiences around the world. Churchill believed that the fight for freedom was ongoing and that complacency was the greatest threat to democracy. His speeches during this period reflected a profound understanding of geopolitical dynamics and a commitment to preserving the values he had defended during the war. Churchill also grappled with the legacy of the British Empire. He believed that the empire had played a positive role in global development, but he also recognized the need for change. The post-war world demanded new approaches to international relations, and Churchill supported the transition from empire to commonwealth. He envisioned a network of nations bound by shared history, mutual respect, and common values. This vision reflected his belief in the power of unity and cooperation. Churchill hoped that the Commonwealth would serve as a model for global partnership in the post-war era. As he grew older, Churchill became increasingly reflective. He often spoke about the burden of leadership and the weight of the decisions he had made during the war. He believed that leaders must be willing to make difficult choices, even when the consequences are uncertain. Churchill's reflections offered a rare glimpse into the inner world of a man who had shaped the course of history. He understood that leadership required not only strength but humility. His willingness to acknowledge his mistakes and learn from them set him apart from many of his contemporaries. Churchill's later years were marked by declining health, but his spirit remained strong. He continued to engage with political leaders, intellectuals, and artists, offering advice and sharing his wisdom. He believed that the lessons of the war must be passed down to future generations. Churchill was deeply concerned about the potential for new conflicts in the nuclear age. He urged leaders to prioritize diplomacy, cooperation, and mutual understanding. His emphasis on peace reflected a lifetime of confronting the horrors of war and a desire to prevent future generations from experiencing the same devastation. Throughout his life, Churchill grappled with the tension between his public persona and his private struggles. He suffered from bouts of depression, which he referred to as his black dog. Yet he believed that facing adversity was essential to building character. Churchill's ability to confront his own inner demons while leading a nation through its darkest hour revealed the depth of his resilience. His personal struggles humanized him, reminding the world that even the greatest leaders are not immune to fear and doubt. His honesty about these challenges has inspired countless individuals to confront their own hardships with courage. By the early 1960s, Churchill had become a symbol of the resilience, courage, and determination that defined the Allied victory in World War II. His legacy extended far beyond the battlefield. He was a champion of democracy, a defender of freedom, and a visionary who shaped the post-war world. Churchill understood that history is not merely a record of past events but a guide for the future. He believed that the lessons of the war must be preserved and shared with future generations. His life's work, both in war and peace, reflected a profound commitment to the values that he believed were essential to human progress. As Churchill entered the final years of his life, the world he had helped shape was undergoing profound change. The Cold War had intensified, the British Empire continued to dissolve, and new global powers were emerging. Churchill watched these developments with a mixture of pride and apprehension. He believed that the values he had fought for, democracy, freedom, and international cooperation, were being tested in new ways. Despite his declining health, Churchill remained engaged with global affairs, offering insights based on decades of experience. He understood that the world needed strong, principled leadership to navigate the challenges of the modern era. Churchill's physical decline did not diminish his intellectual curiosity. He continued to read widely, study history, and engage in discussions with political leaders and scholars. His home at Chartwell became a gathering place for visitors from around the world, all eager to hear his thoughts on global events. Churchill's ability to analyze complex issues with clarity and foresight remained remarkable. His reflections offered a unique perspective on the post-war world, shaped by his experiences during the conflict and his deep understanding of human nature. Despite his engagement with global affairs, Churchill also sought peace and solitude in his final years. He spent much of his time painting, writing, and enjoying the company of his family. Chartwell became a sanctuary where he could escape the pressures of public life and reflect on his extraordinary journey. The gardens he tended, the landscapes he painted, and the books he wrote revealed a man who, despite his public persona, valued quiet moments of introspection. Churchill believed that creativity was essential to the human spirit, and he found great comfort in expressing himself through art. In 1963, Churchill received one of the highest honors of his life, honorary citizenship of the United States. This recognition, granted by President Kennedy, symbolized the deep bond between Britain and America that Churchill had worked tirelessly to cultivate. The ceremony highlighted Churchill's role in forging the transatlantic alliance that had been crucial to the Allied victory in World War II. It also reflected the admiration and respect he commanded around the world. Churchill's influence extended far beyond the borders of his own country. He was a statesman of global stature, whose contributions had shaped the course of history. As his health continued to decline, Churchill became increasingly reflective. He often spoke of the challenges he had faced, the decisions he had made, and the legacy he would leave behind. He understood that his life's work had been shaped by extraordinary circumstances, and he believed that future generations must learn from the past to build a better future. Churchill's reflections offered a rare glimpse into the mind of a man who had shaped the destiny of nations. His humility, wisdom, and profound sense of responsibility set him apart as one of the greatest leaders of the 20th century. Despite his advancing age, Churchill remained a powerful symbol of resilience and determination. He continued to receive visitors, offering insights and encouragement to those who sought his counsel. His presence alone was inspiring, a reminder of the strength and courage that had carried Britain through its darkest days. Churchill believed that leadership required not only vision and resolve but also compassion and empathy. His ability to connect with people from all walks of life reflected his deep understanding of the human condition. Even in his final years, Churchill remained a source of hope and inspiration. On January 24, 1965, Winston Churchill passed away at the age of 90. His death marked the end of an era. The world mourned the loss of a leader whose courage, vision, and determination had helped shape the modern world. Churchill's funeral was attended by leaders from around the globe, a testament to his enduring influence. As his coffin was carried through the streets of London, thousands gathered to pay their respects. The city he had defended during the Blitz now honored him with a solemn farewell. The gratitude of a nation and of the world was evident in the quiet reverence of the crowds. Churchill was laid to rest in the small village of Blaydon, near his ancestral home of Blenheim Palace. The simplicity of his burial reflected his deep connection to the land he had served with such devotion. His final resting place became a site of pilgrimage for those who admired his leadership and legacy. Churchill's passing marked the end of a life defined by extraordinary service, profound wisdom, and unwavering commitment to freedom. His influence continued to resonate, inspiring future generations to stand firm in the face of adversity and to uphold the values he had fought to defend. Churchill's legacy was not merely a chapter in history, it was a guiding light for the future. In the decades following Churchill's death, historians, scholars, and political leaders have studied his life and legacy with great interest. His role in shaping the outcome of World War II has been widely acknowledged, but the deeper aspects of his strategy have only gradually come to light. Churchill's hidden strategy, endurance, deception, alliance building, and psychological warfare, was not merely a response to the immediate threat posed by Hitler. It was the culmination of years of analysis, reflection, and strategic foresight. Churchill understood that defeating a totalitarian regime required more than military strength. It required a comprehensive approach that addressed political, economic, and psychological dimensions. His ability to anticipate Hitler's moves and to shape global events accordingly set him apart as one of history's greatest strategists. Churchill's endurance strategy was central to his approach. He believed that Britain's greatest strength lay in its ability to withstand prolonged conflict. This belief guided his decisions during the Blitz, the Battle of the Atlantic, and the North African Campaign. Churchill understood that Hitler's war machine, for all its initial success, was fundamentally unsustainable. Germany's resources were limited, its supply lines vulnerable, and its ideology a source of strategic blindness. Churchill's goal was to buy time for alliances to form, for the United States to enter the war, and for the Soviet Union to become fully engaged. His ability to maintain morale, inspire resilience, and sustain national unity was essential to this strategy. Deception played a crucial role in Churchill's war strategy. He recognized the importance of manipulating enemy perceptions to gain strategic advantage. From the early years of the war, Churchill supported covert operations, intelligence gathering, and the use of double agents. He understood that psychological warfare was as important as physical conflict. The success of operations such as Fortitude demonstrated the power of misdirection. Churchill's ability to anticipate Hitler's reactions and to shape his decisions through deception was a testament to his deep understanding of human nature and strategic thinking. Alliance building was another cornerstone of Churchill's strategy. He recognized that defeating Hitler required a global coalition. From the moment he became Prime Minister, Churchill worked tirelessly to secure support from the United States and the Soviet Union. His relationship with Roosevelt was one of the most important partnerships of the war. Together they shaped the Allied war effort and laid the foundation for the post-war order. Churchill's diplomatic efforts extended beyond political alliances. He also sought to build connections with resistance movements, colonial leaders, and emerging nations. His ability to navigate complex political landscapes and to build broad coalitions was essential to the Allied victory. Churchill's use of psychological warfare was subtle but effective. He understood the power of language, symbolism, and imagery in shaping public opinion. His speeches, broadcasts, and public appearances were carefully crafted to inspire confidence, resilience, and determination. Churchill believed that words could be weapons, capable of rallying nations and demoralizing enemies. His ability to articulate the stakes of the war, to frame the conflict in terms of moral clarity, and to inspire hope in the darkest moments was one of his greatest strengths. Churchill's leadership was not merely strategic, it was emotional, philosophical, and profoundly human. As historians have analyzed Churchill's strategy, they have also recognized its limitations. Churchill was a product of his time, influenced by the values and assumptions of the early 20th century. His views on empire, race, and international relations reflected the complexities of his era. Yet his strategic insights and leadership abilities were extraordinary. Churchill understood the nature of totalitarianism long before many of his contemporaries. He recognized the dangers posed by unchecked ambition, ideological extremism, and the erosion of democratic values. His ability to confront these challenges with courage, clarity, and determination made him a pivotal figure in the fight against tyranny. Churchill's legacy continues to shape the modern world. The institutions he helped build, such as the United Nations and NATO, remain central to global stability. His emphasis on alliance building, international cooperation, and the defense of democracy remains relevant in an era marked by new threats and challenges. Churchill's life offers enduring lessons about the nature of leadership, the importance of resilience, and the power of strategic vision. His hidden strategy, once understood only by a small circle of advisors, has become a blueprint for confronting complex global threats. The judgment of history has been kind to Churchill, though not uncritical. He is recognized as a leader of extraordinary vision, courage, and determination. His flaws and contradictions are acknowledged, but they do not overshadow his achievements. Churchill's leadership during World War II was instrumental in shaping the outcome of the conflict and in preserving the values of freedom and democracy. His hidden strategy, grounded in endurance, alliance-building, deception, and psychological warfare, was a masterclass in strategic leadership. As the world continues to confront new challenges, Churchill's legacy serves as a reminder of the power of courage, the importance of unity, and the enduring value of freedom. His life's work, shaped by extraordinary circumstances, remains a guiding light for future generations.